हम शपथ लेते हैं कि भारत को 2047 तक आत्मनिर्भर और विकसित राष्ट्र बनाने के सपने को साकार करेंगे।
India is the fastest growing economy in the world. It is the fifth largest economy, projected to overtake Japan and Germany by 2032. Some say India could even become an economic superpower by the end of this century, that is by 2080. By 2047, India is expected to become a developed country. But is this possible? Let's dive into the economics of that. India, even after being the fifth largest economy in the world, is not yet a developed country. Just to ease the pressure off there, China is also still a developing country. But what is a measure of a developed economy? A developed economy is a country where there is abundance of wealth for the citizens, a country where there is high level of economic growth and security. And the way to measure this is the GDP growth, GDP per capita, level of industrialization, the general standard of living, and the amount of technological infrastructure. The UN or United Nations, however, looks at the Human Development Index or HDI, where three living criteria are taken into account: literacy rates, access to education, and access to healthcare. In HDI terms, India stands at 134 out of 193 countries. Now, when you see this chart, you are very proud to see that India is on the fifth position in the largest economies of the world. The GDP growth is robust, with India growing 8% in the last quarter, retaining the fastest growing economy of the world title. Now, to become a developed country by 2047, India's annual GDP growth must be 7.6% on an average, which looks achievable given the growth. Now, in fact, after every economic crisis, India's GDP growth has been robust. But don't be happy yet. Just beside the GDP growth lies the GDP per capita, and here India is lacking, and the difference is massive. GDP per capita is basically the GDP per Indian citizen. In short, the output per person. India's GDP per capita is at $2,612. This is even lower than Vietnam and Bangladesh. India is 140th on the per capita income list. To understand how this is happening, we need to understand what contributes to the GDP. As per the Indus Valley Annual Report by Bloom, 60% of India's GDP comes from private consumption, which is spent by households on groceries, education, and more. So people are focusing on healthcare, education already. Now, government spending is 11% of the GDP, basically the money that government spends to pay salaries, buy equipment, etc. Third is gross fixed capital formation. Now, this is a critical measure. While it is contributing 29% of India's GDP, it is almost double for China. Chinese private consumption contributes lower than GFCF to the GDP. Now, what is GFCF and why is it important? It is basically the amount spent to create productive assets for more than 1 year. For example, a company operating with 10 basic machines, and if it adds one more advanced machine, it will add 10% more to the production capacity, while the basic ones add 5%. Now, the cost of this machine is say 20 lakh rupees. Now, this 20 lakh rupees spent on the additional productive asset is the fixed capital. Gross fixed capital formation is the collective fixed capital investment of all companies and government projects like building bridges, infrastructure, and more. Now, what it does is that it increases production, exports are pushed higher, imports are less because products are available domestically, and it generates growth in various small industries as well. This also increases the employment, which increases the GDP and the GDP per capita. While the Indian government is spending a lot of money on infrastructure and production with mega projects like Bharatmala, Sagarmala, Parvatmala and more, India has consistently underinvested in capital formation. And this is not only for the government but generally for the private sector too. When you look at China, they have invested over 40% of the GDP in capital formation for the past 11 years. And this means China is spending a whopping $7.2 trillion in capital formation, while India's entire GDP is only $3.7 trillion. But why is India underinvesting in capital formation? Well, a key reason to this is because the private sector is borrowing less, and so they are investing less in capital formation. And this is because Indian banks are cautious to give out loans to corporates. Indian corporate debt is 50% of the GDP by 2023 end, while China's corporate debt to GDP is 168.4%. In 2018, Indian banks were facing a crisis. The level of net non-performing assets or NPAs were high and the return on assets were low. NPA is basically the loan for which interest payments were overdue for a period of 90 days. This means that banks were lending too much, and this for 10 years since the financial crisis happened in 2008. The pandemic also added to the woes. And this was the time when banks were about to go bankrupt, but RBI intervened and used firefighting measures and long-term measures to reform the system. And then the banks reduced lending. So now even companies that can pay back the debt sometimes don't get a loan. For MSMEs, which contribute 29% of the GDP, this is a bigger issue because they operate on credit. So even if on paper they have made a profit and have cash, they still don't have it in hand. However, to buy assets, they have to use cash in hand. And banks now have restricted lending, or the interest is high for all these loans. To tackle this, in 2019 post-elections, the government slashed corporate tax. So basically, they said pay less taxes and use it to buy productive assets.
We today propose to slash the corporate tax rates for domestic companies and also for new domestic manufacturing companies.
Now coming to the government spending on capital formation. As we have seen in the past few budgets, the government has been spending a high percentage of GDP in capex. In the budget this year as well, the government allocated 11.11 lakh crore rupees to capital expenditure, which is 3.4% of the GDP. But India's tax collection is not supporting India's ambitions. Only 22 million out of 1.4 billion people in India, which is 1.5% of Indians, pay income tax in its entirety. India's tax to GDP ratio for FY23 was at 17.7%, which is way lower than the peers like UK, US and China. And because corporate taxes were cut to promote capital formation, the tax burden on individuals was more, but most of them don't pay taxes. So what the government does is it relies on borrowing, which increases the government debt. And this debt as a percentage of GDP is 82%, just 2% lower than Brazil. So now the government is spending more money to pay interest on loans than it is actually investing in capital formation. So all in all, private companies are not able to borrow because the banking system needs to be stable for the growth of the economy. So their capital formation is limited. To tackle this, the government slashed corporate tax. But the government is also not able to invest because the income tax that people pay is low and the government debt is high. But is there a solution to this? Yes, by getting foreign companies to invest in India. How? Well, when big companies abroad open shops in India or invest in Indian companies, they can buy more assets, employment increases, so more people pay tax, government debt will decrease because tax collection will be more, and the banks will also be at peace and everyone will be happy. So with PLI schemes, Make in India scheme and much more, the government is also trying to boost this. But the time taken for approvals also need to happen in a faster pace. So can India become a developed country by 2047? And can it become an economic superpower? Well, it depends on how the government improves the ease of doing business in India, which is one of the key focuses of the government as of now. For more such news and views, keep watching ET Now.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to Mirror Now.